Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Liz Krueger, State Senator, and I want to welcome you all to our webinar on Local Law 97, Technical and Financial Resources to Assist with Compliance to Reduce Greenhouse Gas Emissions. Quite a mouthful. We have many people who are joining us tonight, and as always, I want to go over your options, whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook. We have closed captioning for today's event, and as a viewer, you have to activate closed captioning to view the text on your device. Oh, I'm just looking for my notes, sorry. So if you're on Zoom, click the live transcript in the meeting controls to start viewing closed captioning. If you're on the Facebook Live event, you will see a setting button in the bottom right-hand corner of the video. Click on CC for closed caption to activate the process. This forum, like all of our forums, is being recorded, and everyone who RSVP'd will receive an email with links to the event video and the resources that are posted in the chat within a few days, along with the presenters' PowerPoints. So we're going to be providing a lot of information. Don't think you have to write it down because we can get it to you afterwards. I want to thank Manhattan Borough President Mark Levine and his staff for partnering with us on this Local Law 97 event. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors, council members Julie Menon and Keith Powers. The Borough President, Mark Levine, was going to join us this evening, but unfortunately Mark had an unavoidable conflict, so I would like to introduce Tomi Vest, the Borough President's General Counsel, to offer some greetings on his behalf, and she'll be jumping in later to help with Q&A as well. Good evening, Tomi.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for that introduction. I just want to start out by thanking you, Senator Krueger, for moderating this panel and providing the excellent support in organizing this event. Also want to thank Councilmember Powers and Levine for co-hosting the event with our office. And as you mentioned, Borough President Levine can't make this event tonight, but I'm here on his behalf to discuss Local Law 97, which is part of the Climate Mobilization Act. And it's going to impact the energy operation and systems of tens of thousands of buildings in Manhattan alone. Local Law 97 is a critical tool to combat climate change because it requires buildings to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Climate change is the preeminent challenge of this generation, and it's also going to impact the lives of our children and grandchildren. And it's not a problem that can wait until tomorrow. But regulations and mandates can only go so far. Every single fine that gets issued under Local Law 97 presents a missed opportunity. Building owners need access to information resources like the type that we're offering here tonight to make the capital intensive upgrades that may be necessary for full compliance. And right now, the time is of the essence. We're just a little over a year away from the first compliance period, which begins in 2024. And buildings in Manhattan alone will be looking at nearly $600 million in fines by 2030 unless they take action. So building owners and operators need to think about what changes they need to make to their buildings in order to avoid the steep penalties that are outlined in the law. I'm excited to hear from Gina Bocra from the Department of Buildings tonight. DOB recently promulgated rules that give buildings clarity on the limits they'll face, including the requirement that all covered buildings achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. It's an exciting goal, right? And this forum also presents an opportunity for buildings to hear from the Accelerator, which is a free resource that can provide training and one-on-one expert guidance to improve energy efficiency and reduce carbon emissions. So I want to, from the Borough President, extend a thank you to everyone who's taking the time to join us tonight. I hope you find this event helpful and informative. And as Senator Krueger mentioned, I'll be joining the Q&A at the end if you have any questions for the Borough President's office. So thank you.
Thank you, Tomi, and thanks to Mark for sharing you with us for tonight. I won't say, but you're probably more useful than him in this purpose. Oh, I guess I just said that out loud. Never mind. Okay, so again, as Tomi just explained, we have a new law. It's going to go into effect in just a year, and so it's, or just a little over a year. So it's critical that everyone understand what they can do for two assignments. One, to avoid having to pay large fines, and two, more importantly, to make sure that we are doing everything we can to address greenhouse gas emissions, which are the largest source. The building greenhouse gas emissions is the largest single source of problems for New York City. So the critical nature of this law, even if it seems scary to implement, is that we have to make these changes. We have no choice. Our time is running out based on all of the scientific research around greenhouse gas and carbon emission. We all know it's real, it's here. We're having extreme weather events like Sandy and Ida. We have much hotter summers, more intense heat waves. Our water tables are rising, on and on. We have no choice. The good news is if we get this done right, not only will we have an enormous victory for global climate change on behalf of the city of New York, we'll also be able to save money in the long term by ensuring people are on more efficient forms of energy, wiping out our use of gas and oil as much as possible. As we said, the law goes into effect in 2024. So we have four really terrific presenters, because we have an additional person who's joining us. So first we're going to hear from Gina Bocra, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at the New York City Department of Buildings. And Gina will provide an overview of the law and share assistance that the Department of Buildings can provide with compliance. Following Gina, Simon Mugo from the New York City Accelerator Program will provide information about technical and financial resources available. After Simon, we will have the question and answer session, and Tomi will be returning for that. And we will also be joined at that time by Guillermo Patino, Deputy Commissioner for External Affairs at the Department of Buildings, to also help with the Q&A. Many people submitted questions before when they registered. If you have additional questions tonight, you can submit them through the Q&A function on Zoom or in the video comments section on Facebook. I'm warning you now, we've already gotten so many questions, I don't see how we can possibly get through all of them, but we will try to do our best. And again, there will be many resources put in chat for you to follow up with, and all of those will be sent to you in a few days, as long as you signed up tonight or you contact my office after tonight. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Gina Bocra. Hi, Gina.
Thank you so much, Senator Krueger. It's a delight to be here. We greatly appreciate the invitation and want to thank the Borough President and Council members for also co-sponsoring. I'm Gina Bocra. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Department of Buildings and working on the implementation of Local Law 97. Thank you also to Tomi for giving a little bit of background on the law. So I'm going to ask the Senator's staff to share my presentation. And we'll go ahead and jump right into a little bit of background on Local Law 97 of 2019. And if we go ahead and advance to the next slide, Tomi mentioned the Climate Mobilization Act, which passed in May, became law in May of 2019. It had a number of laws in it. So I wanted to give a little bit of context. First of all, it's important to recognize that these build on a foundation of laws that were enacted back in 2009. So building owners have been working to comply with many of those laws prior to the passage of this act. This one included Local Laws 92 and 94, which also require either green roofs or solar photovoltaic systems on new roofs across the city. So that's one of the most aggressive sustainable roof laws in the country. Local Law 95 also changed the scale for energy grades. You've probably seen them in the windows of buildings around the city. Local Law 96 establishes a PACE program, and I'm sure you're going to hear more about PACE from Simon when he talks about the offerings of the Accelerator Program. And then there's Local Law 97, which stands to reduce emissions from buildings, from the building sector. And as Senator Krueger pointed out, the majority of our emissions in New York City actually come from our building stock. And so this targets our largest buildings in the city. So the next slide, I also wanted to share the context at the state level. The state passed legislation shortly after the Climate Mobilization Act that is very much aligned with what New York City is doing. So if we hadn't passed the Climate Mobilization Act in New York City, we'd be trying to figure out how to comply with what the state's goals are. So the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act at the state also sets carbon goals for the city, or for the state, that are aligned with the city. The city was looking for an 80% reduction by 2050. The states mandated an 85% reduction by 2050. But they've also said what we're trying to achieve is carbon neutrality. There's a large component of equity and social justice in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the CLCPA. And it mandates that 35% of funding go to disadvantaged communities. And we have a large percentage of the state's disadvantaged communities in New York City. So we anticipate that a lot of that funding hopefully will be coming to New York City. I also set some interim goals, and these are very important, especially in the context of Local Law 97. Let's say we are going to have a 70% clean electricity grid in New York State by 2030. That's not very far away. And they are making strides towards making our grid cleaner. And they also have said it's going to be 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040. So I'll talk a little bit about how that has affected our implementation of Local Law 97. And it's an all-in policy, meaning it's economy-wide. It's not just about buildings. It's about every economic sector across the state. So it's very comprehensive, and we're really excited to be able to work with the state to make 97 and the Climate Mobilization Act work together with the CLCPA. So if we go to the next slide, I want to just show that background again that the senator mentioned. If you look at the bar chart, that's our emissions in 2016, and those that are colored in blue are our emissions from the building sector. So you can see they account for about 67% or 2/3 of our emissions. So implementing the Climate Mobilization Act means that by 2030, we're going to have all of these great reductions in our emissions, but there are these other benefits that happen. And I wanted to spend just a moment of time talking about those. So in reducing the 6 million tons of carbon, we're also going to see thousands of jobs develop out of implementation of this law. But we also see health impacts. And in New York City alone, we expect to avoid 150 hospitalizations per year and 50 to 130, premature deaths. So this is just another reinforcement that the effects of climate change are upon us. We can see them every day. The senator outlined some of the ways that it affects us. We recently had a discussion with Department of Health that we see about 350 premature deaths from heat every year. So really working on how much carbon is emitted into the atmosphere from our buildings is going to have an effect on people's daily lives very soon, not just in the future. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about Local Law 97 and focus on that for most of the time that I'm going to share with you. It mainly affects buildings that are 25,000 square feet or bigger. And so it's around 50,000 buildings. And these limits start counting in 2024. So next slide. Just a little more general information about the law. It also required that we have a climate advisory board and support that with working groups. So that was launched at the end of 2019. We are about to issue a report on their findings and their recommendations. So look for that. And then the law actually required that the city study carbon trading. So to see if there's a way that carbon trading could accelerate the reduction of carbon in New York City. And that trading study was published by the city about a year ago. And then the law also requires that city operations reduce emissions 40% by 2025. So that's only 2 years away, and 50% by 2030. And I'm just pointing this out because the city has set more stringent goals for itself for our own buildings than it has for the private sector. And I just, as a shout out to my colleagues at DCAS, they are actually ahead of the private sector in their overall emissions reductions. So kudos to them. They are, setting examples and leading the way. So we're very proud of their work. Next slide. The law requires that owners have to submit a report on their emissions for every year beginning in 2025. So that's for the calendar year 2024. And that's on May 1st of every year. They report their full emissions profile for the year. And over time, those emissions limits that are imposed on buildings are going to drop. So it's sort of a graduated approach towards that 80% reduction target. The law only set those emissions limits for sort of what we call the first two compliance periods. It's 2024 to 2029 and 2030 to 2034. So recently we published a rule that sets those limits all the way out to 2050. And that was based on recommendations from our advisory board. And I'll talk through those just a little bit as we move through the presentation. There are also prescriptive measures that are outlined in Article 321, and those are for rent-regulated buildings. And that was initially published with a definition that affected any building with a rent-regulated dwelling unit, and that was changed by another amendment to the law. So it's now buildings with 35% or more rent-regulated units. And those prescriptive measures also apply to houses of worship. So they have a little bit different path, and we're working with DHCR right now to identify where all of those buildings really are. So next slide. So each property has a budget kind of based on emissions limits that are set based on the occupancy of the building. So how the building's actually being used. So multifamily buildings have a different limit than commercial buildings, for example, and we can get into those details also. An architect or an engineer is required to submit the report, and we'll continue to look at how that impacts cost for owners and whether we make adjustments to that in the future. And then here's the information that really concerns most building owners is that if you don't comply, the penalties can be very steep. So the penalties may be as much as $268 per metric ton of carbon that you're over your limit. And for some buildings, that can be quite high, but we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as well. So next slide. And this is the prescriptive list of measures that are applied to buildings that fall under Article 321, those rent-regulated buildings and houses of worship. And you can see if you look through these, and again, these slides will be shared with you, and they are in the law. These are simple for some buildings, but not so simple for others. So we're hoping that we will have some clarification out on Article 321 in the early part of next year. So please look for that. We are working on it. Next slide. And I do want to just mention that we have issued a rule was first published in October. We had a large public hearing on November 14th. Record setter for the department. I think we had around 700 comments and 5 hours of testimony. The rule is going to be published again in the public record very soon, before the end of the month. And it will become effective 30 days after that second publishing. So this first set of rules really clarifies a lot of details that were not specified in the law. And in many cases, the law said that the department had to publish rules to help owners understand the requirements better. So I'm going to go through some of those requirements that are outlined in the rules so you know where to find them. Next slide. So first of all, there's some general guidance on calculations. So we actually provide you the formulas and on how to do these calculations. But when it comes time to report, we'll have a tool with those formulas built in so that owners and their registered design professionals will have an easy way to put the information in, and it'll do that math for you. It also provides some guidance on reporting in the sense that it allows owners to report multiple buildings in a single report. So you don't have to have a separate report for every building. And this is particularly helpful for owners who have central systems that supply, heating, cooling, electricity to multiple buildings on a campus. So that was important clarification in the rule. It covers some compliance requirements for situations like, what if I just bought a building and I'm a new owner? When do I have to start reporting? Or what if I'm an owner and I'm demolishing my building? When do I stop reporting? And then it goes into detail on buildings emissions limits. And I'm going to spend a little time here. There are two big changes that happened in the rule from what was published in the law. And the first is that we transitioned to Energy Star portfolio manager property types. So if you do benchmarking for your building, this would be familiar to you. And then the second big change is that we have transitioned from an 80% reduction target to a net zero target by 2050. So that puts us in alignment with the state. Next slide. So just to walk through this real quick, and there's a series of clicks for the person who's operating. What if you're a drugstore and you look in the law and the only category for you is mercantile, which is covers a lot of different use types, and those use types in the building code are grouped based on egress and life safety. But in portfolio manager, these use types are based on their energy patterns. So this has a lot more to do with emissions than the building code. So the drugstore, for example, you would pick retail on this list. And if you click on an advance, you'll see there it is on the list. You have a lot more categories to choose from here on this list than are in the law. And if you click again, you can see retail includes all of these other uses. These aren't mentioned in the law either, but some owners have these uses in their building. So on this list, you would probably choose retail store again if you have a drugstore in your building. So if you click again, you'll see that the definition can come up one more time. The Energy Star system will list out different types of uses that are categorized. And so all of these different categories now have new limits in the rule, which helps owners who have something like, you can also see on this retail list, grocery store. And grocery stores and drugstores have very different energy consumption patterns. So this recognizes the difference in property types, and it's much more equitable distribution of responsibility for emissions reductions. So if we go to the next slide, again, I've mentioned we've also changed the limits. So we've recognized that carbon neutrality target for 2050. The city has also made that commitment, but that happened after the Climate Mobilization Act had passed. The CLCPA makes that commitment, and it's also in line with the United Nations Environment Program. We have to reduce emissions as much as we can. So 80% was not going to get us where we needed to be. That also takes into account how the grid is changing over time. So I mentioned at the beginning that we see these really great targets of 70% cleaner electricity across the state by 2030 and 100% clean electricity by 2040. And our new limits take those targets into account. So it continues to hold owners responsible for making improvements in their buildings. So we go to the next slide. I have a few more things just to cover that have happened in the rule that I want to make sure owners are aware There are now some coefficients for energy sources that are not in the law. That's important for doing your calculations. There's an option for using time of use when reporting your utility electricity. So there are some owners that really do a great job of managing their energy consumption based on how much carbon there is on the grid. So they're dialing back their consumption when the grid is dirty, and they're saving it, or using energy and storing energy when it's cleaner. And this will give them, reward them in their calculations. There's information for owners that have campus style systems. So this would be a property like Stuyvesant Town that has some large central systems that supply multiple buildings. And then there's some clarification on how we're dealing with distributed energy resources. So those are things like cogeneration, fuel cells, energy storage. There's also clean distributed energy resources, which is defined differently in the law, but that looks at things like on-site solar and on-site battery storage. And then finally, I also just want to point out that this rule clarifies that renewable energy certificates, which is a flexibility mechanism for the law for owners to access, can only be applied to electricity consumption. And that's generally an electricity product. So we'll continue to look and see if there are other renewable energy credits that come onto the market for other energy sources. And we are continuing to look at how RECs should interplay with Local Law 97, which is fairly complicated. And the city is doing more work there. So next slide. I just wanted to point out some of our resources that you can access. There's information on DOB's website. So there's a little bit of information on our main DOB website. We have a sustainability and a greenhouse gas emissions page, but we needed a lot more space to talk about Local Law 97. So we actually developed a dedicated sustainable buildings website. So I think you'll have the links for both of those. There's a lot more detail on our sustainable buildings website, and I encourage you to go there to find information. We also have a buildings news newsletter and a sustainability newsletter. You can sign up for those on our websites. But we're also doing email blasts. We're not waiting for you to come to us. We're reaching out to certain owners directly. And we are going to be offering more trainings coming soon. We're working in partnership with a lot of environmental organizations across the city, working closely with Simon's team at the Accelerator, the Sustainability Help Center. You can find information on these on our websites. And we're obviously working with our sister agencies to get lots of information out there. And we've targeted outreach so far to over 700 individual owners. Because we identified that they had particular challenges on their properties. So next slide, I just want to point out we have not finished. We have a lot of work ahead of us. So if you advance one more, we have some more work to do on the limits. So they could change again in the future. It's very possible. The advisory board wants us to look at an energy efficiency metric in addition to carbon. That would be of interest to the state as well, which may go in that direction statewide. We don't know yet until they publish their reporting. We're looking into other normalizations. So an important one for most buildings is taking density of occupants into account, which the law does not do at this time. And then again, as I mentioned, we're looking at the impact of RECs and trying to figure out how to balance that flexibility with the way we need our grid to change, and making sure that the New York City is supporting that changing grid and doing its part. And the next slide, I also just want to point out that we didn't finish the rulemaking. We just issued the first major rule. There's a lot more to come. One of the things that we're tackling and working on very hard right now is how penalties are going to work. So Senator Krueger mentioned, the potential for large penalties. I've mentioned it. There's also a requirement in the law that we take into account an owner's good faith efforts and other mitigating factors. The city is not interested in fining anyone. What we're interested in is helping owners achieve carbon reductions. And that's going to continue to be our focus. So yes, there are penalties. And if there's a bad actor out there that's just ignoring the law, you're going to pay for that. But if you are really trying to do everything you can at your building, we're working on how we can help you. There are requirements in the law for greenhouse gas offsets, another flexibility mechanism, and we're going to be working on the rulemaking for that. And as I mentioned, clarifying Article 321 and those prescriptive measures is also something that we're working on right now. So look for our advisory board report coming out later towards the end of the month. And next slide, there are some ways to contact us. Please, the first is our email address for our team. Send us your questions. That's why it's there. We want to help, and we look forward to hearing from you. We tell everyone your first stop should be after Department of Buildings, the Accelerator. If you're not talking to them, please reach out to them. They have information about every building in New York City that's subject to Local Law 97, and they can help you with a path forward. And then there's a link to our proposed rule, which isn't super exciting reading. It might put you to sleep, but it does have some very important details in it. And we're here to explain them if you need help. So again, thank you so much for inviting us to share this information tonight. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to all of the questions.
Thank you so much, Gina. I know you gave everyone more information than they think they can absorb. Again, we'll be sending out all the materials, including your PowerPoint, in a couple of days. And so many questions are pouring into the chat. I feel like we'll just have to have another one of these events after the next set of rules are provided. But right now we're going to move, as you recommended, to the New York City Accelerator Program so that Simon Mugo can help explain what kind of services they can assist everyone with. Good evening, Simon.
Good evening. Thank you so much for hosting Senator Liz Krueger, as well as Manhattan Borough President's Office and DOB. Gina, thank you so much for being an ally and a close partner. To everyone, good evening, and thank you all for joining. If you give me 1 second, I'll share my screen. We can dive into the presentation. Great. So hopefully you can see my my screen in full screen. As I mentioned previously, my name is Simon Mugo. I'm the Deputy Program Manager for the New York City Accelerator Program. And tonight, just to give you an idea of what we'll cover during this presentation, I'll start off with an overview of New York City's pathway towards decarbonization as more of a framing of the rationale behind the Local Law 97, as well as the New York City Accelerator. And I believe Gina covered this extensively, so I might skip over a few of those sections that were previously covered. And then we'll shortly after, we'll move on to an overview of the Accelerator Program, where I'll cover a bit about the types of assistance that we provide in relation to Local Law 97, but also go into some tools and resources and other services that we provide aside from the support that we provide related to Local Law 97. So that said, in terms of the framing or sort of the background in terms of New York City's pathway towards decarbonization, I think, as I mentioned previously, Gina covered this in depth, and I think the only thing that I would add or really underscore is the fact that majority of the emissions we have here in New York stem from our buildings. So over 68% of our emissions are attributed to buildings. And so tackling and really gearing towards emission reductions in buildings will have a big impact in enabling us to reach our goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. So by funding programs such as the New York City Accelerator, the city really provides assistance, free technical assistance, and a unique opportunity to allow building owners to, one, understand how the law impacts their building specifically, as well as to access a variety of different resources that are available to them to help reduce the cost of making upgrades within their buildings. So just to bearing this in mind, just to give you some background on the Accelerator is a city-backed program that helps building owners to control costs, meet compliance requirements for local laws, as well as to boost their performance in their buildings. So we typically provide assistance to any privately held building or privately owned building throughout the 5 boroughs. And I, state the fact privately owned to note that publicly owned buildings, city-owned buildings are, as Gina mentioned, on a different trajectory in terms of reducing their carbon emissions, and DCAS is really the entity that's leading the charge. So the Accelerator is really geared towards privately owned buildings and providing them with the assistance they need to understand the laws, as well as to get access to financing, as well as incentives from the utilities, as well as NYSERDA as well. The other service that we provide is free online trainings. So we do have online learning center that has trainings that are geared towards a variety of different stakeholders, be it building owners, building tenants, building operators, and it's really geared towards understanding what the different stakeholders can do to reduce their buildings' energy emissions, as well as their energy use. So how does the program work? Typically, we work with buildings 5,000 square feet and above, and buildings that are smaller than 5,000 square feet. We're still able to provide assistance by referring them to program partners such as the Center for New York City Neighborhoods that have resources that are really geared towards the smaller building types. As far as how the program works, really, the first step would be to contact the program through our general hotline, as well as completing a contact form through our website. At that point, you would be connected to an account manager who would really be your point of contact from start to finish. So your account manager is really dedicated resources that would work with you to understand how the local laws impact your buildings, develop a roadmap or a plan of how you can achieve compliance and even go beyond achieving compliance. And then they would enable you to connect with service providers and other resources that you would need to actually implement the measures. In terms of how the program works, or if there's any costs associated with the program, as I mentioned previously, the program is supported by the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. And as such, there's no catch, no cost. All our services are free and they're available to any building owner, building stakeholder within the 5 boroughs. So just to give you an overview of the typical customer journey, the first step is really learning about the program. We have a variety of different events. We also do a number of outreach and marketing activities to promote the program and promote the awareness around the various local laws. And so once you learn about the program, the first step would be to get in contact with an account manager to have an initial intake conversation. So during this conversation, we'll collect some initial information about your building, in terms of your building address, and then if you have any initial concerns or key concerns that you're looking to address, whether it's an equipment failure, if your boiler is having an issue, or you have a specific project in mind and you're looking for financing or resources to enable you to reduce the cost of implementing that measure. At that point, we would work with your building account manager would work with you to develop a scope of work or identify a list of ECMs or energy conservation measures that you would like to pursue. We would then facilitate access to a service provider. So just to reiterate, I think the New York City Accelerator is really there to accelerate the process of decarbonizing your building. And so we're not contractors. We don't do the actual installs. We just facilitate the process to make it easier for you to understand what resources are available and how you can take advantage of the different programs that are available. At that point, you would install or implement the measures. And once you install the measures, we would then stay in touch. We would provide you with educational opportunities. As I mentioned previously, we have an online learning center, but we also have events that are informational and really useful to individuals who have either participated in the program or would like to learn more about the program moving forward. So just to break down the steps in some more detail, in terms of the first step of learning about the program, I mentioned that there's a variety of different ways that you can use to get in contact with us. You can call us through our hotline and the numbers provided on that slide. And at the end of the event, I will share the slide deck so you would have access to this information. But you can also send us an email through our InfoAd account, or fill out a contact form directly on our website. And once we receive that initial point of contact, the first person who would reach out to you is a program coordinator who's really well versed in the different skill sets that we have on the team. And through that initial conversation they would have with you, they would identify which partner or which account manager would be best suited to serve your building and serve your needs. So we have the different types of specialists we have are financing specialists. We do have a solar specialist, affordable housing specialist, as well as new construction specialist. And so based on that initial conversation, the program coordinator will make a decision as to who would be better suited to serve your building. And they would then make an initial introduction, and the account manager would then schedule a follow-up discussion with you to get some more information on your building, and then start developing a roadmap in terms of what your goals are and how we can help you achieve those goals. So as Gina mentioned, and a few minutes back during her section, the Accelerator does have a lot of information on most, if not all, privately owned buildings in New York. So we collect that information through a variety of different resources and partners, including the Department of Building, Department of Finance, and other resources. So we have a very good understanding of how your building is performing, and the account manager will be in a good position to help give you actionable advice regarding your building. Some key resources I want to highlight is that we do have a variety of different tools and resources on the website. And I'll just like to call attention to the Building Energy Snapshot, which is really the latest tool that we've added to the website. And later on in this presentation, I will highlight or give you an example of what the tool can do. But essentially, the data that I mentioned or alluded to is that we have on most privately owned buildings in New York. We have made a public portal in order for you to access some of that information. So it's really curated to provide you with the most value, and it gives you information as far as the building letter grades, potential emissions estimates for as it relates to Local Law 97, as well as some key ECMs that you can pursue to enable you to reduce your energy as well as your greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of the second step, the account manager will really collect the data, and during that process, it's more of a dialogue and conversation between you and the assigned account manager, and that during that process, they would also share the information that we have on your building, just to give you a sense of what areas you should prioritize and what things you should look for and look at within your building. We would then do an analysis where we would compare the data we have, as well as input some new information that you would provide, because the data that we have is really static. And so you would have the latest information in terms of upgrades that you've implemented in the building that may have not been captured, or there might be a lag between that information getting into our database versus real-time information which you are able to provide. So during that analysis phase is where we would sort of true up the information that we have and take into account the key updates that you've provided. We would then work with you to prioritize a list of measures and really find a way to sequence the work in a way that's most beneficial to you and to your needs in your building. And then step 3 and 4 is really where the project's actually implemented. So once you've made a decision on which measures you'd like to pursue, we would develop an implementation plan in terms of identifying a list of contractors who can install the measures. we would then also identify incentives that can help reduce the cost of these projects. So if you're not aware, NYSERDA, or the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, has a number of incentive programs that are available to buildings in New York, as well as the utilities. So both Con Edison as well as National Grid have energy efficiency programs that provide incentive dollars to reduce the cost, the upfront cost of making investments in your building. So based on the scope of work that you would identify with your account manager, we would then create a package or identify a list of incentives that would be most relevant in terms of the scope of work that you've developed. And we would then facilitate access to those incentive programs. So we work very closely with the Con Edison program teams, as well as National Grid and NYSERDA. And so we would facilitate access to those programs in terms of assisting you with applications, assisting you with making contacts with those utility entities, as well as answering any questions you might have about the application process. Now, that said, I think in this section, I'd like to give you sort of a quick overview or a snapshot as to what types of resources we can provide, or what types of data the account manager would review with the building owner. So if we're specifically looking at Local Law 97, I've listed here 3 examples of buildings that are real buildings, but we've changed the addresses just to anonymize them. But in this case, the account manager would pull up some key critical information on those buildings and have a conversation with the building stakeholder to help them understand what their potential penalties would look like in regard to Local Law 97. So if you look at the first building, that building does have estimated fine in 2024, which is the first compliance year for Local Law 97. And so this is information we would share with the building owner and indicate that they would need to take action at this stage in order to avoid any potential penalties in 2024. And the other 2 examples, they're not subject to any fines in 2024. However, they are subject to fines in 2030. And so they have, a slightly longer runway in terms of the time that they can plan for these measures and identify what key ECMs or energy conservation measures that they would like to pursue, ahead of time in order to avoid any potential fines in 2030. So some of the types of systems that we look at are, or the types of energy conservation measures we look at are lighting, heating system upgrades, cooling system, ventilation, looking at domestic hot water, as well as the building envelope and the elevators, as well as the roof. So roof insulation, I think, is one key measure that comes up in a lot of the buildings that we work with, where adding roof insulation provides a lot of different benefits, but key of which is really reducing the amount of heat loss during the winter, which could go a long way in terms of reducing their emissions. So those examples, I think some of the recommendations that you might hear from the account managers are listed in this table. So depending on how far off the building is in terms of their greenhouse gas budget, as Gina mentioned, there are different types of recommendations that we would make. So depending on the severity of their or how far off they are in terms of their budget, there are different measures that we would recommend. So in the first line, buildings that have or are looking to get a reduction of between 22% to 29%, in those cases, we would typically advise that they invest in maintenance, invest in installing low flow fixtures, installing air sealing throughout their building, and looking at heating system upgrades. So these are all measures that are incentivized by the utility programs as well as NYSERDA, and so the upfront costs would at least be mitigated by the availability of those incentives. Now, if the building is looking at getting additional greenhouse gas reductions, so a 29 to 48% reduction, they would be recommended to do all the above. So air sealing and the other measures in the top line. But in addition to that, there would be we would recommend that they look at roof insulation, in addition to air sealing, replacing their heating system, looking at lighting improvements and heating system controls and sensors. And similarly, in the last line at the bottom, if a building is really facing a huge fine or they're really above and beyond their greenhouse budget, we would recommend that they look at more decarbonization and deeper retrofits, which are doing all the above, as well as considering installing heat pumps or heat pump hot water heaters, as well as upgrading some of their old windows. So this is just an example. It's not an exhaustive list, and it's not prescriptive in the sense that if you're looking at a 22% reduction, we would specifically recommend those measures. But this is just to give you an example of the types of measures or the types of projects that we can assist you with and help identify both financing as well as incentives. So in terms of some key tools and resources I'd like to share, this is an example of the building energy snapshot tool that I alluded to earlier. So this is the most recent development on our website. It's a tool that is making public a lot of the data that we have on privately owned buildings. So the way it works is you would go on the New York City Accelerator website, you would input your address on the tool, and you would get this report that really highlights a lot of key metrics that we think are important to share with building stakeholders. And you can look up any building, any privately owned building within the 5 boroughs, and we do have a contact page that allows you to connect with us directly after you've seen the results of the building energy snapshot. So as the name suggests, it's really just a snapshot. It's not an exhaustive list of all the data that we have in our database, but it's really just indicative of how well your building is doing and if there are any specific things that you should look at. And I think it's really a great tool for any building stakeholder to look up a building that they have a relationship with, whether it's you're a tenant in a building and you just want to get a sense of how the building you live in or work in is operating. This really just gives you a quick snapshot of how it's performing.
Simon, I'm going to ask you if you can sort of finish up just so we can get to all the questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. This is actually the last section. So I'd just like to quickly cover New York City Accelerator, the PACE program, the Property Assessed Clean Energy Financing Program. This is a financing mechanism that was activated through Local Law 96, and it really establishes a financing protocol or mechanism for buildings to finance energy efficiency and clean energy upgrades in their building and finance that through their property's tax bill. So this allows for longer term and more flexible financing, and some of the other key benefits are listed here. And the one thing that I really want to highlight is that PACE can be transferable upon property sales, so it doesn't necessarily restrict your ability to sell the property. And also just want to highlight the fact that PACE can be retroactive to projects that were completed up to 3 years earlier. So if you have done some big capital upgrades within your building and they are energy saving measures, there's a way for you to finance them through PACE, and it could be retroactive up to 3 years. In case you have any questions, here's our contact information, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much. I didn't mean to be rude to you. I want you to stay on camera, but I also want Gina and Tomi to return on camera. And we're also now being joined by Guillermo Patino, Deputy Commissioner for External Affairs at the Department of Buildings. I hope we're being joined by him. Let's see if he's here as well. I see. Yes, he is. Welcome, Guillermo. So we have so many questions and then so many new ones that came in. I'm going to do my damnedest to not do repeats of questions and try to hit many different areas. And whoever thinks they have an answer, just jump on in. So we've just learned so much. And just to clarify, it does seem that these regulations will apply to all New York City buildings, but in different ways. Are there any buildings that this won't apply to?
Well, Senator Krueger, generally, this does not apply to our smaller buildings across the city. So this is our 50,000 largest. And so the law mostly applies to buildings that are over 25,000 square feet. But if you look at the nuance in the definition of the law, if there's a lot that has multiple buildings and those buildings sum up to over 100,000, then that lot must also comply. So occasionally a small building in a larger group of buildings can get kind of sucked into this law as well. But we've got some precedents, and we generally will work with the owner to make sure that the law actually applies.
Great. And I know we've said 25,000 square feet a couple of times tonight. If you are in a 6-unit building, do you know, is that above, below? How do you figure that out?
Well, you can check on DCP's website and see, if you have your tax bill generally will have a ballpark on your square footage. Department of Buildings uses a more comprehensive calculation for that square footage. So there's a lot that gets excluded by Department of City Planning, by Department of Finance, and we count everything. So every square inch is in there, which generally means that it increases your chances of complying and meeting the requirements of the law. So there are sources to find that information out.
Fine. And buildings that have rent stabilized or rent controlled units, are there any exemptions for them or extensions in the time frame for getting things done?
There are, and I'm glad that someone asked. I wish we had a really simple answer, but it's a very complicated question. The law addresses them very differently. So buildings that were initially in that group of rent regulated, 1 dwelling unit or more, and then the law changed. So now it's 35% of your dwelling units have to be in rent regulation for the building to be under Article 321, those prescriptive measures. And those buildings that are 35%, they report to us in 2025 on those prescriptive measures, and then they're done. They don't come back to us the next year. However, if you were in that 1 to 34%, now you're under the law, you have a 2-year delay. So I just want to point everyone to some of the resources that we have on our website. There's a web page dedicated to affordable housing, and it goes through all of the different flavors of affordable housing. So it includes rent regulation, federal programs, income restricted. There's a lot of difference in how these buildings are treated. So I just want to also take an opportunity to explain income restricted, or many Mitchell-Lama properties don't report to us until 2035. However, by that time, they need to meet the limits for 2035, which means they need to be doing work to get there. And we're just not making them report until then. So check out that affordable housing information. It's on our website, and it's also the exact same information on HPD's website.
And so you already covered Mitchell-Lama cooperatives and limited equity cooperatives would fall into that storyline, that they have to 2035, but they've got to be in compliance at that time.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So there are lots of questions that are sort of like, well, should I wait a year or two? Maybe the technology will get better. Maybe I don't have to do anything. But basically you're saying there's no good reason not to be doing your homework now, not starting to learn about what your options are. And, frankly, if you need to spread it over more years for cost issues, then it definitely makes sense, even if you've got extra years, to be starting now and not waiting. I mean, that's what I'm taking from all this.
Absolutely. And then again, I'm just going to emphasize, I hope Simon already sold everyone on the great capabilities of the Accelerator, but if you haven't called them, call them tomorrow and get started.
I was going to say the same thing. Is there any different rules? Oh, who did I just cut off? Anyone?
Oh yeah, Tommy.
Sorry, Tommy.
Sorry, no problem. I was just gonna add that, I think and Simon kind of touched on this, compliance is gonna look different for different buildings, but in many cases, it's gonna be a combination of energy efficiency upgrades and then, potentially electrification measures. So it may make sense for buildings to kind of take those energy efficiency steps, which will, certainly be cost saving measures before you maybe need to see if you need to make those deeper cuts. So I think as Simon presented, you can have tiers of work done, and you should definitely attacking that low hanging fruit sooner rather than later.
And then is there any special rules affecting older buildings? This is an example. Somebody has a building over 100 years old. I actually live in one of those.
I do too, Senator, and there are no rules based on the age of the building. However, I will say there is the opportunity for an adjustment to your limit if you have a landmarked or historic property, and there are certain things that landmarks or the historic nature of the building are just not going to allow you to do. So you may push the building as far as you can get it to go, and then you still don't meet the limits, then there's a pathway for you to get relief.
Got it. Okay, so yes, people are asking about financial assistance at the state level or city grants or other sources of funding in order to go green and avoid the fines. So I think a couple of things were mentioned maybe in the chats. Anyone want to reiterate? Yes, Simon.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think in terms of the incentives, I think we're very lucky in New York. We have, incentives from the utilities as well as incentives from the state. So NYSERDA has a variety of different programs that cover everything from energy audits all the way through installing solar. And the utilities have a number of different programs, some of which are free direct install programs where they would actually install low flow fixtures in multifamily buildings at no cost to the building owner. They would also hand out LED light bulbs to the tenants. So there are a lot of different programs and resources available. Some are, free direct install. Others are, it's really just to subsidize the cost of making those upgrades, but they wouldn't necessarily cover the full cost. But in terms of financing, I think PACE is also another good option. Just looking at ways to spread out the costs over a number of years rather than making the payments all upfront. So.
Good. So people are interested in rebate programs that may be available for some of this work and for HVAC improvements. Do either of these sites that you work for have a listing of the various rebates that might be available at the federal, state, and city level?
So we don't list all the incentive programs, but that's sort of a service that the account manager does. Is based on your needs, they curate that list because in some cases we found that it's overwhelming providing a full list of all the different programs, and we found it more useful to have more of a curated list based on a specific project or specific building. So it's something that we can make available. You would just have to contact the program.
Okay. And there was a question that I think parallels this for Simon that somebody wrote in. So if your building is going and getting quotes from specific engineers or specific contracting companies on things that should be done, can the Accelerator group help people evaluate whether that is the right thing to do or that's the best deal, or even say, we know companies that are doing really great work here, so like putting out a recommendation list, or can they get that kind of information from you?
I think we try to refrain from making direct referrals or making recommendations to a specific vendor. We could help you understand a bid and understand why one is better than the other, but the decision ultimately will be the building owner or the building stakeholders to make. And in terms of solar, we can provide a bit more hand-holding in terms of if you have a large portfolio you would like to have a single vendor and you don't have the resources or capability to run an RFP. That's a service that we've provided in the past. And then also financing. We have a financing specialist who's really amazing and really understands a lot of the different financing products that are out there. So if you have a specific project in mind, they can help you determine which financing product makes sense. Is it PACE or is it equipment lease, or all the different options that are available?
Will all older buildings now using gas and oil be forced to turn to heat pump technology?
That's a question we get a lot, Senator, and I think that over time, we anticipate that most buildings will need to electrify their heating and cooling. And I just want to add to what Tomi was saying earlier, you start with that low-hanging fruit, but start your planning now. And particular, electrification of a building may be a very long-term plan and a long path. And we're working very hard to make sure that our rules recognize that it may happen incrementally and not all at once. And we're also working very closely with Con Edison to identify where there are barriers and make sure that we remove those barriers from buildings that do want to electrify. But that is our best solution. We have to stop burning fossil fuels. And so we need to address the fossil fuels that we combust in our buildings, which really have a big impact on our health, not only because of what it's doing to our atmosphere, but because of the indoor air quality. So it's a transition that most buildings should make over time. And we're going to pay particular attention to those buildings where it's really difficult.
Right. Is moving from oil, gas boilers and heat to steam heat an acceptable alternative under these laws?
I think it's hard to say yes or no in general. It would really depend a lot on the building. And we do have buildings that rely a lot on the steam system. And it may make sense depending on how we energize that steam system in the future. Con Edison obviously is very interested in maintaining that system, which has certain value, and not just stranding buildings that are on that system now. So that's a transition that they are looking at. And if they're successful in decarbonizing the steam grid, the local law 97 doesn't care if a building uses steam. So that is a potential. So it's hard to say now that that's a bad idea for a building. You would have to talk to a registered design professional about your specific building to see if that's a good choice for you or not.
Got it. I know I represent the east side of Manhattan, and there's quite a bit of Con Ed steam heat in various neighborhoods in my territory. I don't know how true that is citywide, but I know that we actually have quite a few buildings that are steam heat buildings. All right, this is interesting. So let's say you live in a condo building where each unit has an individual HVAC and in each apartment, and then they have large glass curtain walls. Who's supposed to be responsible for making sure that this all adds up correctly for the building?
Well, most condo buildings have a condo board, so there's some entity that represents that group of owners as a whole. And that is they're an essential element to making that building comply with the law. That said, each condo owner is going to have to do their part, and we all will, depending on whether you're renting, whether you're in a co-op, whether you're in a condo, we're all going to be affecting how a building complies with the law. When it comes to a condo and an owner has control of their equipment, that may be an easy decision for that particular owner. I can understand they're asking about, what do I do about my big curtain wall? Well, that's what the condo board's responsibility is to take care of those shared components of the building And over time, you may want to look at replacing part of the windows, all of the windows, and these decisions may have big impact on your comfort, your energy bill, and a lot of returns for the individual owners over time. So again, it's important to talk to a registered design professional, talk to the accelerator, and see what things, make sense as first steps for your building.
And does the city expect that there's going to be any kind of carbon trading system so that you can basically buy or sell pollution rights on, as we have with the RGGI program for businesses at the state level?
So there was a study that was required, and the study determined that if the city were to implement a carbon trading study, which is a large administrative undertaking, that there could be some minor acceleration to our emissions reductions. And it could also make it slightly more affordable for owners. And they caveat by saying it's slightly more affordable because it's already pretty affordable for most buildings to comply. So there's definitely support in the study for a carbon trading program, but the law just required the study. We would have to have additional legislation in order to put a carbon trading study in place. And there's a lot of opposition to carbon trading from our environmental justice community. So the city will have to think very carefully if it were going to go in that direction. What we'd rather see is, we make sure that any kind of mechanism that is driving compliance in New York City has those other co-benefits of creating jobs, improving health, making sure that all of these impacts are happening locally. And carbon trading could also delay some of those things.
I would also just point out too that renewable energy credits, I think, kind of maybe achieve some of the goals that the person who was asking the question seemed to be alluding to, which is, can I buy my way into compliance? Not to say that that's what we hope to see with renewable energy credits, the opposite, in fact, but it is a kind of alternative path to compliance for buildings who, for whatever reason, are unable to reduce their own carbon emissions.
So here's a related question then. So my building already has solar panels. That's not me, it's the question from the person. Will there be opportunities for individual buildings to install battery storage and perhaps help with load shifting and selling their surplus electricity?
That's a great question. And thank you, Senator, for bringing that one to the top. It's the rulemaking that we just issued in October describes some of the ways that will be taken into account. So if owners have energy storage on site, if they do have solar on site, these things can contribute to reductions in their own emissions. And then if they are actually installing these things on site, but then sort of exporting the benefits of them to the grid, or essentially to another owner that's a covered building, then they can still get credit for them in certain situations, because we want to incentivize installation of solar and installation of batteries. These are really important distributed energy resources that will contribute a lot to our transition to a clean grid.
Thank you. Quite a few people have variations on this question related to, might the city council reopen this law and make modifications in any ways? I mean, some people are asking, will they give us extended years? Will they decrease the fines? Will they decide to come up with more grant money for those who need it? Lots of variations on, might the city be modifying this law? And I know none of you are the city council per se, so.
I can jump in and take that one first, Gina, since you've been handling the bulk of these questions. Yeah, I was formerly at the mayor's office as early as the beginning of 2022. So in my background there, have pretty close to the conversations about whether this law would be reopened or not. I can tell you there's a lot of resistance to reopening the law, pretty strong resistance, I would say. Not to say that it won't happen, but when the council has reopened the law, they've actually made it more stringent, as Gina mentioned, with regard to affordable housing, increasing the number of buildings that are for affordable housing that could actually take advantage, or decreasing the availability of that alternative pathway for affordable housing. So I don't think, crystal ball reading here, council is its own entity, but I don't see this law being reopened in such a way that compliance periods get pushed out, or requirements are reduced, or special interests are able to influence it in such a way that buildings should rely on that, especially given that 2024 compliance period is really just around the corner. As far as city incentives, I know this is something that the city has been thinking about a lot for a very long time, but I think there are generally speaking, some legal hurdles to the city giving money to private property owners directly in the form of a grant. So PACE, which has come up a number of times in this conversation, really is, I think, the city's, what they envisioned as the city's assistance with the financing piece and the funding piece. So if there are additional incentives that come online, I think, again, crystal ball here, my guess would be that it's not going to come from the city. It would be coming from state or federal incentives, or from the utilities.
Thank you. So there's a number of questions that sort of tie into what if Con Ed is the problem? So I'll start with, and again, this is Manhattan, so we're Con Ed as opposed to the other boroughs, some of the other boroughs. So if my building wants to put in electric systems replacing whatever I'm doing now, including electric water heaters instead of gas, but Con Ed's telling us that there's no place on the grid for us to add electricity to our building, what do we do? Is that actually true? Can Con Ed say our grid isn't covering you for A, B, and C when we already have you hooked up for E, F, and G? I don't even know that one.
So, Senator, this came up in our working group and advisory board discussions, and Con Edison was on our advisory board. And they've been very engaged with the Department of Buildings as we've been working to implement the law. So we are speaking on a regular basis with them. This has come up a lot, and they consistently say that the only issue is an issue of time. So if owners are planning and they reach out to Con Ed with enough notice, so as soon as you start your project, you should be reaching out to someone at Con Edison to say, hey, we are looking at increasing our electric load. They get their approvals from the PSC on what they do with their infrastructure. So they have to plan in advance. And so the more notice you give to Con Edison, the more likely it is that they're going to be able to accommodate your specific needs in your time frame. The less notice you give to them, the harder it is for them to accommodate you. So we've even reached out to them about specific properties that have unique challenges. Like there are certain properties in the city that are not connected to Con Ed at all. They produce 100% of their own electricity, and they produce it with fossil fuels. Those handful of properties include 28,000 housing units. So you can bet we've been talking to Con Edison about those particular properties. And so if there's a property that is really concerned that they're in a weak area of the grid, reach out to us or reach out directly to Con Edison and start the conversation now.
Great information. I had no idea there were 28,000 units that didn't actually get their electricity from the grid. Wow. So a detailed question, but I'll try to sum it up. So you're responsible for the whole building, but you have commercial space in sections of the building, and Con Ed apparently his policy is not to let you know the usage in those commercial spaces, even though you'll be responsible for the whole building. So, for example, I love the example. Suppose they start a Bitcoin mining operation in their commercial space, which, by the way, would then probably use up half of Manhattan's electricity if they were doing that. How are we supposed to find that out so that we can try to plan for our building, make sure we meet the requirements? And if Con Ed won't give us that information, how are we going to get it?
So, and we didn't add Bitcoin mining to our property use list.
An example. Because I thought it was a good example.
It is a good example. The other one that we regularly hear is, certain chemical substance production operations, also very energy intensive. I hear this owner's concern. There is a process at Con Ed that you can go through to identify the energy consumption of other meters in your building. And I'm not sure if they can tell you on a monthly basis what their particular energy consumption patterns are like. But Local Law 88 of 2009 required that certain commercial spaces in a building have to be sub-metered. So eventually, by 2025, all of these spaces should be sub-metered, and we'll continue to talk with Con Edison to make sure that the owner of the building can get access to that data. It may be easier to access from previous years, and then you can look and see what the patterns are and make assumptions about how that commercial tenant might behave. But I do understand what you're saying is, what if somebody new comes along and suddenly their energy use increases drastically? Well, if their property type, based on the Energy Star portfolio manager framework has changed, then you have the opportunity to come to Department of Buildings and say, hey, we've had a change in our building. We need to adjust our limit. So there is that option, and that can happen. And then, we'll continue to monitor this challenge for owners. In the benchmarking law, it actually says the tenants are obligated to provide their information to an owner, but that happens at the end of the year. So I hear the concern, and we'll continue to talk through that issue with Con Edison.
Thank you. All right, so this is either a bunch of questions or just an easy no. Is Local Law 97 compliance related to the building energy grading system? And if so, how? Is it related?
Tangentially, yes. But it's based on national averages. So it's a directional indicator. And it's better if you call the Accelerator, talk to Simon's team, and get a really good understanding of what's happening in your building.
Got it. And then the sub questions, and we won't touch them now, is again similar to, but you have no control over the commercial spaces in the building and what they're doing there with energy. Okay, for your building rating. Let's see, we're basically done at time. I'm just
I would,
Tomi.
if I could just jump in really quickly on that commercial lease issue. I think the other option that building owners may want to pursue is tightening up some of the requirements that are built into the lease, so that if there are kind of drastic overages or penalties that are incurred, potentially they could renegotiate that lease or future leases to account for that. So I think in some ways it does seem really fair that building owners are on the hook for what their tenants are doing. But on the other hand, building owners are always on the hook for what their tenants do in some sense, right? And the lease is a legal contract between the property owner and the tenant. And the idea is that there's control in terms of legal rights, and you can spread the risk in that document.
Thank you. Okay, let me just check if there's any other questions that showed up online that are urgent. So a lot of the questions are very detailed and are perfect for calling up the Accelerator program and asking them, because some of them are very specific to the kind of building you might be living in or owning. And so I think I'm not going to ask any more of those questions, because I think I am just going to thank the four of you for being with us tonight and for contributing so much. And I think you already knew this. I certainly now know this. This is pretty complex stuff. And I don't think there's a building out there that will be able to figure it out for themselves unless they're finding some expert in the city to give them sort of a roadmap and good advice and direction. And so I urge everyone who was listening tonight, don't hold off on this. Start doing your homework as soon as possible. The sooner you start the assignment for yourself, as was said, the low-hanging fruit first, the better off you and your building and our environment are going to be. But I think it's also clear the city does not intend to try to get people or buildings in trouble. We don't actually, I have to be careful because government is always looking for money, but I do not believe that this program is intended to just figure out how to get money from people, but rather a way to clearly incentivize people to do what they need to do on these buildings, because our future is dependent on meeting these carbon reduction targets. And New York City, again, as has been said several times tonight, the low-hanging fruit to save ourselves in New York City is going after building emissions, right? So if we go after building emissions and we are successful, we have made a huge win for our environment, not just for the people who live here, but overall in the big picture for the region. And we are actually also, because I don't think I got said tonight, but it's a question, is this all going to be more expensive when we convert? No, the research shows that oil and gas are going to continue to be more and more expensive over time while causing all kinds of environmental damage. And the newer versions of sustainable energy, and we talked about it, solar, wind, offshore wind, the potential for offshore wind in New York State is enormous for production of energy. These are all costing far less per kilowatt hour than what we're all paying to Con Ed right now. So don't just think of it as I have to do all of this and it's going to cost us money. Think about, I'm going to do this, I'm going to help save our environment and actually save our building utility costs moving into the future. And please, it was brought up once, but don't forget, there are a variety of tax rebates for upgrading your building and moving to sustainable energy at the federal and state level. And you absolutely want to look into those options as well. And I know as a state legislator, we've been talking about trying to do more of that so that we also can be assisting in this assignment. So with that, we're way over time. So again, I apologize to probably the 50 questions we didn't get to tonight, but I do want to thank all of my guests, Tomi, Gina, Simon, Guillermo. We didn't let you speak, Guillermo, but thank you for joining us. I want to thank you all
Thank you for having us.
for being here and for being so helpful. And again, the materials you provided and the resources in chat, which we'll send out to everybody, it's like a little, I don't know, college education for you as you're attempting to figure this all out. I want to let everyone know that our next event is scheduled for Thursday, January 12th at 10 a.m. And it's the first session of my 5-part senior roundtable series. And this year our series will focus on housing for older adults. The January 12th session will provide an overview of affordable housing options for seniors in New York City. I wish everybody a very happy, healthy holiday season. Remember, COVID's still out there, the flu is still out there, and you just have to continue to be careful and smart and vaccinate. And remember, there are also colds out there. I actually had a cold last week. I forgot there were colds, as something as minor as that. So everyone have a great December. See you in January. Thank you all.